don't know what is going on with computers in this room in the past couple of weeks. It's been exciting, we'll say exciting. All right, so hi everyone. We have a bunch of people in the room. We have a bunch of folks online as well. I see some from our class, but also from NR 322. So I'm glad you could join us. Today is a research talk. So we're going to be hopefully discussing things that won't be like your traditional formal seminar. And we have Dr. John Salerno from HDNR who's going to talk about his cool work looking at human wildlife impacts, climate change, and food security in Africa. For those of you in NR 493 who read the article, all right, okay. Good, that's good. We also have the data. So I pulled the data down as a CSV, and I made a shapefile of the points as well, just so we have it at the ready. And that's located both, well, the CSV is on Canvas. I didn't put the point layer on Canvas, sorry. The CSV is on Canvas, but the point layer and the CSV are in the N drive. So for anyone who wants to play along and take a look at it yourself, it's on the N drive, classes, spring 2022, NR 493, in a folder with basically that name, wildlife impact. So then you can take a look. So yeah, with that, Jonathan, I will send it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Beth. Can you all hear me okay?
We can. I'm going to try to make the volume a little louder, but I think it's okay.
All right.
Yeah, so you can go ahead.
Right. So although I can't see anyone, it's nice to be here with you all, sort of as it goes these days. And yeah, I think I'm gonna get started by talking a little bit about some of the things I'm interested in, some of the research topics I engage with a little bit more broadly, and then we'll spend the majority of the time talking to you all about this project, Mkavango Zambezi, and then hopefully leave I don't know, 10-15 minutes, maybe a little more for some discussion. And I guess this isn't exactly an entirely accurate title, or rather it's probably a better title for some of the larger efforts that are going on right now in my lab, including not just the work with wildlife and food security in sub-Saharan Africa, but some of the work a bit more broadly. So apologies if you were expecting a hugely broad sort of global talk. It's going to be a little bit narrower, and we'll get into that in just a minute.
Everyone here okay?
I was just going to say, Beth, feel free to interrupt me if there are questions. I totally welcome questions during the talk at any point, but also if there are any audiovisual things, definitely let me know and we can pause and straighten those out.
Okay, I think we're okay. We can see your slides. We can even see your face.
Wonderful. This is a rare victory for remote talks. Well done.
Victory. Okay.
Okay. So this slide again, very broad. We're all over the place with the work that these images are trying to suggest. But I thought at least really briefly, I'd give you an idea of where I'm coming from in terms of the different research questions that we're asking in my lab. So a lot of my work has to do with human adaptation to environmental change in a few different places and in a few different contexts. So what I'm suggesting here with this photo in the upper left of Fulani herders in the West African Sahel is some of the work dealing specifically with human mobility and how individuals and households, specifically agropastoralists and pastoralists, will use mobility in different ways as an adaptive strategy. And so I'm looking at these questions in the Sahel and also in East Africa, specifically thinking about land change and climate change and how people move as an adaptation to different dynamics going on in their land systems, and how in turn those mobility patterns can impact changing environments in different ways. I'm also, like I mentioned, very interested in land systems change, but in particular, how we can understand land systems change in the context of large landscapes and protected area networks. And so this photo here is the western boundary of Queen Elizabeth National Park in Uganda. There in the top left of that upper right image, you can just barely see an edge of the Ruwenzori Mountains, which is this incredible mountain range that slopes up off to the west there. But what this landscape creates with the Ruwenzori Mountains to the west, and then Queen Elizabeth National Park, which you can see on the right-hand side of that image, is a very narrow strip of arable land that people are able to farm. And so one of the things that I look at specifically is how individuals and communities in these spaces that are potentially bound, in this case by protected areas, but how they might make decisions and how they interact with protected areas. One of the ways that they do interact with protected areas, and we're going to spend some time talking about it today, is through interactions with wildlife, or more specifically through crop depredation or livestock depredation. What we're suggesting here with the image there in the bottom right is that in some cases, some of these human-wildlife interactions can be shaped to or shaped for economic gain for communities. If communities have the authority to manage lands for wildlife conservation, they can choose to utilize wildlife, and in many cases the most efficient or profitable way to do so is through trophy hunting. And so that's another type of human wildlife interactions that a few people in my lab are studying. In this case, lion trophy hunting, but there's also a number of different ways that people and communities can utilize wildlife resources. And so community level governance and community-based conservation is a theme that takes up quite a bit of my time. And then there in the bottom left, where this photo is actually from Wyoming, but a more recent project is based here in Colorado, and it looks at informal governance around mitigating risks, of wildfire. And so we're studying with a number of institutions in a few different ways here in the state how communities can potentially collaborate in different ways to try to mitigate risks from wildfire. So specifically, we look at the social network or the structure of all of these different connections between individuals, local communities, collaborative groups trying to promote mitigation, and then higher level, more formal governance structures that we'd see with the Colorado State Forest Service or the US Forest Service, for example. Okay, so there's a lot of text in this slide. We're not going to read through it all. I wanted to put a bit of a finer point on those generic topic areas that we saw with the photos in the last slide. I always think it helps to do this with sort of pointed research questions and also some positioning within theoretical or disciplinary contexts. Today, we're going to look at this one question about human-wildlife interactions, climate, and land change impacting household vulnerability. But I'm putting this up a little bit of as a teaser. If any of these other questions or ideas look at all interesting, then feel free to bring them up later, either kind of midpoint in the lecture or at the end of the talk through discussion. I'm happy to talk through them if anyone's interested. So like I said, today we're going to be focusing on this main research question regarding wildlife and climate and household vulnerability. I want to first take a minute to position this question along with some of the work that we just looked at more generally in larger social ecological systems or complex adaptive systems efforts. And specifically, the efforts that are linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. To be clear, beyond even just the title of this slide here, this drawing, this figure is taken very directly from Jack Liu's 2018 paper on nexus approaches. And essentially, it's an attempt to organize systems thinking around progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals by looking at the overlap of different challenge areas. So the framework here is imperfect, but it's a meaningful way to look at different dynamics, like, for example, situating these focal nexus approaches as directly impacting specific sustainable development goals. And then we focus specifically on synergies or trade-offs that indirectly influence other sustainability goals or areas of interest. And because most of my work needs to be attentive to spatial and temporal dynamics, this framework here nicely situates these linkages across scales. The nexus approach, according to Jack Liu, is about embracing interconnected sectors together through interdisciplinary teams of researchers and policymakers. Our example here, the nexus of food and climate and wildlife or biodiversity, has specifically been called out by Claire Kremen and Adina Marenlander as not just really important. They call these three elements the triple threats of the Anthropocene. So not just important, but also this challenge that fundamentally requires inclusive stakeholder engagement in landscapes that are supporting both people and also biodiversity together. So thinking about these working landscapes as ways to approach broader challenges. And we'll touch on this point of inclusive policy and management a little bit later. So much of our framework here is just simply identifying systems processes. The nexus sectors there are directly influenced by social and ecological drivers. They're in the boxes on opposite sides of the figure. And of course, these drivers are interacting themselves. Like I mentioned, the represented systems dynamics there are linked across scales through these teleconnections or telecouplings, which we're going to ignore or push to the side for the conversation today. But it's where my mind spends a lot of time these days, thinking about linkages or couplings or connections across spatial scales. Okay, so like we mentioned, in many ways, why we're going through this effort is that we can identify direct links to specific sustainable development goals, and then by trying to articulate system pathways or tease apart these systems dynamics. The framework argues that policy and practice can anticipate or preempt or leverage some of the trade-offs and synergies associated with specific SDGs. And then most folks would argue doing all this enables influencing indirect links to most of the other sustainable development goals in kind of larger, sort of more holistic approaches. Okay, we're gonna watch this quick clip. I don't know if you could hear the audio on that. I don't know if you were meant to. It's a funny conversation. You hear a motorbike in the background kind of humming, but people are commenting, "Wame Rudy, wa tembo, wame Rudy." It's like I say, and shh. People are very cautious about the elephants moving through their farmland. So this little clip, I wanted to show it to sort of quickly try to immerse you in the Kavango Zambezi system in Southern Africa that we're going to get to in a second. And so it was from an adjacent project, but I wanted to begin with it. Those elephants had just been run off after damaging that field that we could see in the foreground. And the video was WhatsApped to me a few weeks ago from one of our local elephant monitors, who these LEMs, they respond to crop depredation incidents, and they also coordinate different community programs on the ground. What they're trying to do or trying to attempt is near real-time monitoring of elephant crop depredation. As an extension of some of these research questions we're about to get into. And the efforts are in part to address some of the challenges with measuring human wildlife impacts. So please ask me about the LEM activities if you'd like to know a little bit more about what we have going on kind of currently as an extension or follow-on to the research we'll talk about. So the overarching goal of this project is to support human livelihoods and wildlife populations in these large interconnected conservation landscapes. And what we wanted to do here in the Kavango Zambezi was to integrate some ongoing work on changing rainfall dynamics and smallholder adaptation from Central Africa with more general interests in human wildlife interactions and coexistence. We're motivated to do this, and CASA is an ideal system to try because of three main reasons. First, CASA is this critical area for biodiversity, not just because it protects about half the remaining African elephants in the world, but because CASA is this experiment in multi-country hierarchical conservation governance. It does have legacies of colonial and oppressive conservation policies, but there are also some reasons for optimism and potentially a more inclusive policy future. We'll touch on this in a little bit. The second reason is that conservation science as a field, and specifically species conservation, is in some ways slow to integrate across multiple domains and systems dynamics like climate. So this work is an opportunity to push the field toward more explicit systems thinking. And then the third reason, the 2.3 million people, primarily smallholders, living inside CASA boundaries are vulnerable to adverse climate impacts, along with many other factors, including interactions with wildlife and variably supportive and inhibiting governance and economic structures. So this work is mainly about systems level problem identification. But we're also leveraging a number of related projects to try and understand pathways toward some potential solutions. This here is an operationalization of the food security, biodiversity, climate nexus into a conceptual model of the CASA social ecological system. And the nexus approaches offer this meaningful high-level framework, especially to tie together disparate projects. But we need to go quite a bit further to specify a mechanistic model. Here in CASA, and with this model, we're adapting a concept of household vulnerability from work by Billy Lee Turner that understands vulnerability to be a function of exposure to environmental impacts or change, conditioned on the sensitivity to that change, moderated by adaptive capacity. So in this configuration, we have hypothesized relationships among these latent or unobserved traits in the model, in the center of those circles, which we can estimate empirically through measurements of the indicators represented by those outer boxes. In the project, we're just now getting to the point where we can analytically estimate the relationships among those latent traits through a structural equation modeling approach. So those results are not here yet. They're sort of soon to come, along with interpretations within the context of this larger system. What we have been able to do so far, though, is begin to tease apart some of the specific linkages in the model. And like we mentioned before, specifically those linkages that are to do with wildlife interactions and vulnerability. I wanted to take a couple slides to really hammer on the point that spatial science is absolutely fundamental to research here in the system. What we're looking at here is a stack of images looped over a year, showing the pulse and the ebb and the dry up of the Chobe-Zambezi River confluence. So the Zambezi-Cubango region, more broadly, only receives about 500 millimeters of precipitation annually. But it's part of this fascinating hydrologic system where huge amounts of rainfall in the wet season that fall in the mountains of Angola to the north flow down the Zambezi and Cubango rivers, reaching the Chobe floodplain and the Okavango Delta, not during the wet season, but as the dry season begins. So this means that wildlife and human natural resource harvest are dispersed across this vast dryland landscape during the very brief wet season. Before, wildlife and people and livestock all collapse into these perennial water sources when the water and forage dry up everywhere else. So all of the social ecological processes we're interested in have very spatially explicit dynamics across this broad and highly variable landscape. Another key aspect of spatial science that we need to employ was, in this case, in the project, regarding food security, or food insecurity more specifically. Recall that we're asking how exposure to environmental change and wildlife conflicts will impact household vulnerability, and then how potentially household adaptive capacity can reduce these harmful effects on vulnerability. One problem that we faced at the start is that the standard for measuring household vulnerability is food insecurity. But available food insecurity data look like these here at the left. They're aggregated primarily at the national scale in Southern Africa, at least. So with these existing data, we don't know anything about how food insecurity of one community might differ from another. Or more importantly, for our study, the data wouldn't allow for measuring food insecurity between households that experience varying levels of crop depredation by wildlife. What we need to do is measure food insecurity across households in the landscape area of focus, while at the same time paying attention to their spatial associations, the households, with protected areas, also wildlife movement corridors and natural resource areas. And this is what I'm suggesting here with this image on the right that shows the spatial extent of one household's primary natural resource footprint. Here's a summary of the research effort. This inset in the upper right of the figure shows the spatial extent of the study system. CASA is about 520,000 square kilometers of protected and communal and private lands across 5 countries. And these are all, the land use types are all under different varying management strategies. structured by formal and informal governance arrangements. Just to give you an idea, the 520,000 square kilometers is bigger than Texas. It's bigger than all of the member nations on their own. So this huge area. The natural landscape is arid and semi-arid savanna woodland. And there's a gradient of rainfall and suitability for rain-fed agriculture that you can see in this figure. But this masks soil characteristics. So much of the study areas are relatively poor or weathered Kalahari sands. And data are collected in these 3 sites that are colored as sort of a salmon. I don't know if you can see that very well. In polygons at the center of the map labeled A, B, and C. In particular, the Botswana and Namibia sites, they're on the lower end of rainfall tolerance for maize. And so livelihoods incorporate a higher proportion of livestock raising and floodplain foraging. And of course, I mentioned the human and elephant populations, which overlap in many areas due to the mobility and seasonality of vegetation and surface water. The study sites are located in these areas of human wildlife space use overlap near the perennial water sources, like we mentioned before, along the Zambezi River and the Chobe-Linyanti confluence. Fieldwork that supports the results we're about to see took place in 2016 to 2018. My spatial scientist and land systems colleagues led most of the unmanned aerial surveillance or drone work, along with a lot of the vegetation sampling. And the goals for this part of the research tie back to the vulnerability model and trying to measure exposure to environmental change. And we do this in part by measuring and then modeling land function. For example, the relative availability of woody and herbaceous vegetation to link to household natural resource gathering and livestock foraging patterns. And this is what I'm indicating here with the derived vegetation model there in the upper image. And then our University of Botswana and University of Namibia colleagues and I led the human science data efforts focusing on households, which among other things, attempted to quantify food insecurity and other vulnerability indicators like crop yield and natural resource use and the spatial footprint of natural resource harvest, like we just saw, along with other livelihood capitals and also crop depredation by wildlife. We'll look at methods shortly here in a little bit, but they included processing climate and land cover data in Google Earth Engine, and then estimating Bayesian statistical models, and then that structural equation modeling approach, that we saw a few minutes ago. So here's our abbreviated core question again. And this first result shows the output of Google Earth Engine analysis using daily satellite-based rainfall data from 1981 to 2019. And the purpose of this effort here is to characterize the context of rainfall and rainfall change in the region. In other words, a type of exposure to environmental factors from our conceptual model. A close friend of mine and agroecologist is our partner here, helping to try and form meaningful measures of rainfall in terms of maize yield, given the not very available data. So we're looking here at mean growing season length in the left 2 panels, the trend over the record in number of dry spells during the growing season, or 10-day dry decades to be precise, in the center column, and then trend in season length on the right. And the bottom and the top rows are just study area and then CASA-wide extent. So they're the same analyses. A key limitation here is the very coarse spatial grain of the rainfall estimates. which is at about 1 kilometer resolution. We believe, though, that there is appreciable variation in rainfall among households to explain some variation in crop and food security outcomes. And it is borne out in the models, but it's still an important limitation to state up front. Also, temperature estimates or available temperature data are even more coarse. So despite the demonstrable impact that, for instance, peak daily temperatures would have on maize over 30 degrees Celsius, the data aren't suitable for this type of household level analysis. The two main takeaways here are that we see trends toward more dry spells and shorter rainy seasons, but that the trends are also pretty spatially variable. And just as a descriptive finding from the household data, maize yields are only about 500 kilograms per hectare, which is extremely low, and crop depredation by wildlife impacted about 60% of households annually. And elephants are primarily the main problem species. The main thrust of this first paper that we'll look at, the paper that I think you read, was to operationalize that vulnerability pathway that I showed earlier into a statistical model predicting household food insecurity from rainfall measures and crop depredation, and then this suite of controls. So the logistic model structure is pretty straightforward. I'm summarizing it here. So in addition to the household level fixed effects, the varying or random effects that we're including are for communities and sites. And those random or varying effects help to control for how food insecurity might be patterned or clustered at these different levels. And the estimation is done through Bayesian inference in STAN. Okay, so somewhat surprisingly, even with the coarseness of the rainfall measures, a trend toward shorter rainy seasons predicts food insecurity among households, even in the presence of community and site level effects. Let's see, I'm not sure, I think you can see my cursor here, but I'm indicating with this red arrow and that rainy season length effect there in blue. So in that coefficient plot, with the estimate for the effect on food insecurity on the y-axis, and then the specific effects there are laid out on the x-axis. This rainy season length effect that I just pointed to, it's that longer seasons reduce food insecurity, but the trends in the data are all negative toward shorter rainfall seasons. And so the observed patterns on the ground are shorter seasons predicting higher food insecurity. Also, that other effect we're highlighting in red, crop depredation by wildlife, primarily elephants, also predicts higher food insecurity. Also, and shown in those slightly grayed out effects in the model function, but not in the coefficient plot, crop depredation may have even greater harmful impacts in those households that are already experiencing shortening rains. So this is estimated in another model that's not shown here or in the figure through the interaction effect. So the effect is only credible at 90%, and the model is less parsimonious than the one we're presenting here. So we don't show it as a key finding either here or in the paper, but it is at least suggestive of these interacting or compounding effects of wildlife and rainfall change. The figure at the right here and this plotted blue line shows model predictions of the food insecurity odds across the range of observed values of change in rainy season length. And the data are those ticks along the x-axis that we can see. On average, households have experienced in the study system about a 5-day shortening of the rains over the past 10 years. So with only 500 millimeters of precipitation a year and an extremely short rainy season, if that season gets on average 5 days shorter per 10 years, that's potentially a substantial impact on your growing season and yields. So then here in red, we're showing on top the model predictions for the households who are experiencing the mean quantity of crops destroyed by wildlife on top of the effect of those shorter rainfall seasons. So the take home there is that yes, households are experiencing these substantial and potentially additive or compounding effects on food insecurity. So all of this paints a pretty clear picture of vulnerability that's not that novel, but particularly in terms of human-wildlife interactions, the results bring these different pieces together and at a scale that hasn't yet been done. So results demand the question of what do we do now, or what can households do in the face of these impacts? We have a hypothesized pathway there in that little reminder figure in the upper right that forms of adaptive capacity, and we conceptualize these as livelihood assets like human capital or social capital. These can potentially reduce vulnerability, sometimes by moderating negative effects of environmental exposure. So in a set of subsequent analyses that somehow made it to publication a little bit earlier than the paper we were just looking at, we took a closer look at how people are using the landscape around them. Recall that the data collection effort included mapping individual households' natural resource collection footprint, or these areas that they use to gather different natural resources. These lighter polygons in the figure show areas in each of the study sites where people were in fact using the landscape for natural resource gathering. And the triangles that you see in those figures are just the sample communities. And this is maybe my favorite result of this larger project. In a similar statistical modeling framework as we just saw, we can see that households who are capable of switching to use more gathered food resources in the event of experiencing crop depredation, those households experience a reduced impact on food insecurity. So those gathered foods that they're potentially able to tap into from the areas on the map here include things like fish or papyrus tubers or bush fruits or wild meat in limited cases. So this picture that's emerging is that wildlife impacts like elephant crop depredation can be severe and experienced on top of worsening climate conditions. But also that certain pathways of adaptive capacity that households can access or implement can reduce household vulnerability.
Sarah has a question.
Oh, wonderful.
Go for it.
What was the criteria used for determining what the household footprint were? Like, how was those polygons determined for each household?
Oh, totally. So that's a great question, by the way. So as part of the household surveys that were conducted in a sample of households in each of these study communities that were sampled from the sort of larger sites, there was a list created of specific resources and quantities and frequency of gathering and specific place names where households went to gather the resources. And then a second wave of field work took those lists of place names, and with key informants in each of the communities, they went out to those locations and either wrapped a GPS track around those specific place names, or used some triangulation and specific waypoints to be able to later go back and digitize a polygon sometimes using like Google Earth, as simple as Google Earth imagery, to draw these resource areas. For example, like a specific wetland or a patch of forest that they gather specific food resources. And then those place name polygons were then associated with the data collected in the household surveys and the associated data, for example, like intensity and frequency of resource harvest. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, for sure. Okay, it's a great question, by the way. All right. Right, so a lot of the problem identification or identifying potentially this pathway of adaptive capacity still demands answering the question about interventions or what can households or policymakers or practitioners do to support livelihoods on the ground. Regarding wildlife and specifically elephant impacts, there's an acute need to give people and governments from elephant range states greater agency in conservation policy. And this is the argument that we lay out in a recent perspective article that's, I think, probably down there on the bottom of the slide. So CASA is this multi-level governance system, like we mentioned before. So greater agency of people and communities and governance means that communities should have the authority in national scale land use planning, but there's also a need for greater equity of voices in international policy fora like CITES or the IUCN specialist groups. And trying to rely on evidence here and to not get too bogged down in a political argument, this policy rethinking that we're arguing for needs to be very cautious about consumptive approaches to wildlife management. Michael Drake, a student of mine, has modeled hunted elephant populations and shown that offtakes are currently unsustainable, which is clearly very bad for elephants. But he's also showing that either current or even sustainable quota could still not offset the costs that communities experience from crop depredation. So it's absolutely necessary to improve the capacity of communities to mitigate these wildlife conflicts, even in the case of utilizing wildlife resources through trophy hunting. And so finally, this last point here, despite some downsides of trophy hunting, community-based wildlife conservation can support stronger institutions at the local level and provision livelihood benefits, including food security. And this work here and some other recent evidence suggests that there are pathways to better livelihood outcomes in human wildlife systems, and these pathways probably hinge on or pass through some complicated governance dynamics. So hopefully this issue of governance invites some discussion here in the couple minutes we have left. This is all that I have for us. Maybe right now we'll turn it back to Beth and try to Beth, maybe you can try to extract something useful to talk about for the remaining time here.
Yeah, first, I guess I'll ask if there are any questions, and if anyone on Zoom wants to put something in the chat, put it into the chat for everyone, and then I can see it up here. But are there any other questions? I have a couple. I wrote them down when I wrote your article, which I'll admit it was today. I read it today. Sarah?
I have a question about, because it talks a lot about the impacts from elephants, but it doesn't talk a lot about like the causes there. Is it during migration? Are the elephants destroying the crops because they're foraging for their own food in them? Like what exactly are the elephant impacts?
Right, elephant impacts are specifically crop depredation, and it occurs during that floodplain pulse at the end of the wet season or growing season going into the dry season, just as people are harvesting primarily maize and some millet. And And there's some really neat work from Amanda Stronza's group and an EcoExist project that they're looking specifically at elephant space use and mobility throughout the landscape. So they're identifying, at least in this system or a system close by, that elephants avoid human settlement and fields as well. They will eat crops if fields are planted directly adjacent to movement zones or corridors, but they're not really out in farmed landscapes foraging for food like they would in a more natural system. So that work points to some ideally some potential interventions where if land use zoning could prioritize maize farms away from the movement zones that elephants prefer to use, you could potentially minimize a lot of those impacts, or specifically the elephant crop depredation.
So mostly to just, it would adjust maybe some timing use as well, and then like kind of just a rearranging of how people are using their farmland then?
Right, exactly. Or at the community level, how and where communities zone lands for use for farming and for grazing. So essentially prioritizing cultivation away from the areas that elephants prefer to use.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. There's a neat short documentary video. It's probably just about 10 minutes long that the EcoExist project put out. Beth, I'll try to forward you a link. It's just a short video, shows what they're doing on the ground, and then I can link to some of the publications that come out of that project as well.
Okay. All right. We have a couple of minutes left. I had a couple of questions just about the survey. So
Sure.
You did all this research, you made these fantastic conclusions, but it was all based, not all, but partly based on a survey of households. And so that's what the data we have are. Just for those of you in the classroom, I'll just move it over. So it's this CSV I'm zoomed in on some points right here. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the survey and how you conducted it. And then you had to anonymize the data as well, and I'm guessing that was done after analysis.
Right. After analysis. Yeah. So I think the data the data file that you see should be the relevant household data, but then also I think that CSV also includes extracted household values for the climate analysis. I'm not positive, but I think it does. So you'll see values associated with each household that correspond to those rainfall layers that I showed in one of those figures. Yeah, so it was a big randomized sample, and among a lot of other things we ask about, there's a specific instrument to measure food insecurity called the Food Insecurity Experience Scale. It's a generalized tool incorporated into the Sustainable Development Goals and the measures associated with those. So yeah, we're going around to a lot of households, asking a bunch of questions that are then converted into a quantitative scale of food insecurity. And then we run spatial analyses associated with those household footprints we saw and with the climate data. And then the household locations are spatially jittered, and the location, the coordinates after the jittering or the randomization or anonymization are published there.
Neat. Yeah, in the article, which I made it all the way almost to the end, you were talking about how it was a stratified sample in different areas, and it was every nth household.
Yeah.
So this kind of gets back to what we were talking about the last 2 weeks in our class about how to decide where to sample. And so just getting back to that same idea. So here it's totally different. We're not looking at watersheds here like we were 2 weeks ago. We're looking at how to decide what houses to go conduct a survey at. And then that survey information has an XY coordinate and then anonymized, but that's where all this information comes from. So for the 322 students in here, we were just talking about where data comes from, and surveys was one of the options. And so here's a really good example of that. So I just wanted to mention that and kind of tie that back in. But it is after 4:50. So officially, I guess I'm supposed to like let you go home or something. But if anyone has any further questions, we can stick around for a couple more minutes, but I won't make you. Does anyone have any more questions? Miles?
I guess I have one. Do local governments provide any funds to farmers if their crops are raided by elephants?
A very small amount. There's a compensation scheme. It's utilized a little bit more frequently for livestock depredation by large carnivores. But there is a small compensation scheme. The problem is it's with understaffed and under-resourced management authorities, wildlife authorities. It's really hard for the authorities to verify these reports of livestock or crop depredation. And so the resources are less frequently used. I think if there was a better resourced program, that's definitely one of the many approaches to reducing these impacts. And then the other thing mentioned really quickly, in the Namibia site, the community conservation area, the Conservancy, funded a community level compensation program for crop loss. That is a very successful institution that they created and put in place, but it's subject to the revenue streams and the global tourism market. So if the community-based wildlife area is not able to generate enough revenue, that compensation scheme will be underfunded and so then underutilized.
Well, with that, I guess we'll officially wrap up. John, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you all. Thanks, Beth, for the invitation.
Really cool article. So for those of you in 322, if you didn't read the article yet, I can get you that link, and it's just really interesting stuff. So thank you. Thanks to everyone on Zoom, and have a good evening.
Bye, everybody. Have a good evening. Yeah.